3,000 years, naval battles had followed the same fundamental pattern. Ships closed to visual range, maneuvered for position, and engaged with whatever weapons their era provided: rams, arrows, cannons, torpedoes. Admirals stood on bridges and watched their enemies through binoculars. Victory went to whoever could see faster, shoot straighter, maneuver better. The ocean was a two-dimensional chessboard, and the pieces were visible to both players. On May 7th and 8th, 1942, in the Coral Sea northeast of Australia, that 3,000-year tradition ended. Two carrier forces fought for 2 days across hundreds of miles of ocean. Aircraft struck at ships their pilots had never seen before that moment. Admirals made life-and-death decisions based on fragmentary radio reports and educated guesses. Surface vessels never sighted each other. When it was over, both sides claimed victory, both sides had lost carriers, and neither side fully understood what had just happened. Naval warfare had entered a new dimension, and no one had a manual for it. The Japanese plan was ambitious, but logical within the context of early 1942. They had conquered an empire in 5 months: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. But the southern flank was vulnerable. Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea sat less than 300 miles from Australia. In Allied hands, it was a base for bombers that could strike Japanese positions. In Japanese hands, it would complete the defensive perimeter and position forces to threaten Australia itself. The plan called for an amphibious invasion, supported by carriers. The land-based aircraft at Port Moresby would be neutralised. The convoy would land. The port would fall within days. It was the same formula that had worked everywhere else. Admiral Inoue commanded the operation from Rabaul. His forces included 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, both modern ships with experienced air groups, plus the light carrier Shoho, battleships, cruisers, and the invasion convoy itself. The carriers would sweep into the Coral Sea, eliminate any Allied naval forces, provide air cover for the landing. Japanese confidence was absolute. They had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse in December. They had ravaged the Dutch East Indies. American carriers had launched a few pinprick raids, but nothing suggesting they could stand against Japanese carrier divisions in open battle. What the Japanese did not know was that American intelligence had broken their naval codes. Station Hypo in Hawaii was reading Japanese message traffic not perfectly, but well enough to understand operational intentions. Admiral Nimitz knew about the Port Moresby operation. He knew the timing the forces involved, the routes. He could not stop it with the limited forces available in the South Pacific, but he could contest it. 2 carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, were ordered south. They would find the Japanese carriers and attack them. If they could damage or sink the Japanese flat tops, the invasion would be untenable. It was a calculated risk. American carrier doctrine was still developing. Coordination between ships was uncertain, but doing nothing meant conceding Port Moresby. The American task force assembled south of the Solomon Islands in early May. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded from Yorktown. He was a surface warfare officer, not an aviator learning carrier operations on the job. His counterpart on Lexington was Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who had more carrier experience. The command arrangement was awkward. Fletcher had tactical command, but Fitch had deeper understanding of carrier warfare. They would have to figure it out under fire. The Japanese were also learning. Shokaku and Zuikaku were under the operational command of Vice Admiral Takagi, another surface warfare officer. The air groups were commanded by career aviators who understood aircraft, but had limited experience coordinating multi-carrier operations. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive action and decisive battle, but the mechanics of finding and striking enemy carriers across hundreds of miles of ocean were still being worked out. Both sides were inventing carrier warfare in real time. The opening moves were confused. Fletcher sent Yorktown's scouting aircraft fanning out across the Coral Sea on May 7th, searching for Japanese carriers. What they found was the invasion convoy and its close escort, including the light carrier Shoho. Fletcher made the decision to strike immediately. Shoho was not the primary target the fleet carriers were, but she was a threat, and she was available. Lexington and Yorktown launched a coordinated strike dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, over 90 aircraft heading for a single small carrier. Shoho never had a chance. The American strike arrived shortly after 11 a.m. Dive bombers came down from altitude, punching through the flight deck. Torpedo bombers pressed attacks from multiple angles, overwhelming the ship's defenses. Within minutes, Shoho was burning and listing. Within 20 minutes, she had rolled over and sank. It was efficient, coordinated, devastating. The radio call that became famous came from Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon. Scratch 1 flat top, the first carrier sunk by carrier aircraft in history, went down in the morning sunshine, and American aircrew flew back to their ships, feeling invincible. They should have felt nervous. The Japanese fleet carriers were still out there, unseen, dangerous. Through a series of communication errors and bad luck, Japanese search aircraft had spotted the American oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims that morning and reported them as a carrier and cruiser. Shokaku and Zuikaku had launched a full strike at these targets, dozens of aircraft sent to attack a tanker. The Japanese pilots found their mistake when they arrived at the contact position. Some attacked anyway, sinking both ships. Others searched for better targets and found nothing. By the time they returned to their carriers, it was afternoon, too late to launch another strike. Both carrier forces had struck at secondary targets. The main event was postponed to the next day. That night, both sides knew approximately where the other was. Radio direction finding search aircraft reports and dead reckoning put the enemy carriers within striking range. Fletcher and his staff debated launching a night strike. American carriers were experimenting with night operations, but decided against it. Japanese pilots were not trained for night carrier operations, so Takagi had no similar option. Both forces maneuvered during darkness, trying to position themselves for the morning search phase. Whoever found the enemy first and launched first would have an enormous advantage. The morning of May 8th began with both sides launching search aircraft at first light. American doctrine used scout bombers, SBD Dauntlesses carrying a bomb load, so they could attack targets of opportunity. Japanese doctrine used specialized reconnaissance aircraft. Both sides also launched combat air patrols over their carriers and prepared deckload strikes to launch immediately upon locating the enemy. The entire tactical situation balanced on which side's search aircraft found the enemy first. A Lexington scout found Shokaku at 8:20 a.m. The report was immediate and accurate, 2 carriers' course speed position. Fletcher ordered the strike launched. Yorktown's aircraft were already spotted on deck and launching within minutes. Lexington took longer, her deckload needed to be respotted, but by 9 a.m. both carriers had committed their strikes. Over 80 aircraft heading northwest toward the contact position. The Japanese found the American carriers at almost the same time. A reconnaissance aircraft from Zuikaku reported 2 carriers at 8:22 a.m. Takagi ordered the strike launched. Both Japanese carriers began spotting aircraft dive bombers, torpedo bombers, Zero fighters. By 9:15 a.m., the strike was airborne, 69 aircraft heading south. The 2 strike packages were in the air, simultaneously passing each other somewhere over the Coral Sea, heading for each other's carriers. It was the purest form of carrier warfare, a mutual exchange of blows with the outcome determined by pilot skill, luck, and the defenses of the target ships. The American strike found Zuikaku and Shokaku around 10:30 a.m. The 2 Japanese carriers were operating together, protected by cruisers and destroyers, with Zeros flying combat air patrol overhead. A weather front was moving through the area, towering cumulus clouds, rain squalls, broken visibility. Zuikaku disappeared into a rain squall before the Americans could coordinate their attack. She would survive the battle untouched, hidden by weather. Shokaku was caught in clear air. The American attack was not well coordinated. Yorktown's aircraft arrived first and attacked immediately. Torpedo bombers went in low, trying to position for anvil attacks from multiple angles. Dive bombers pushed over from altitude. The Japanese combat air patrol was aggressive and the AA fire was intense. Shokaku maneuvered violently, turning into torpedo tracks, trying to throw off the dive bombers. Several torpedoes missed, several bombs missed, but some hit. Shokaku took 2 bomb hits on her flight deck, penetrating into the hangar spaces, starting fires. A third bomb hit forward, causing more damage. She was not sinking, but she was burning, and her flight deck was unusable. She could not launch or recover aircraft. Lexington's strike arrived minutes later, found Shokaku already damaged and smoking, and pressed additional attacks. More bombs hit, causing additional fires and flooding. Shokaku's damage control teams were competent. They contained the fires, managed the flooding, kept the ship moving, but the carrier was out of the battle. She would survive to be repaired but could not participate further. The Americans had neutralized one Japanese fleet carrier. The price was being paid simultaneously 200 miles south. The Japanese strike found Lexington and Yorktown around 11 a.m. The American carriers had turned into the wind and increased speed to launch additional fighters. The combat air patrol was up-vectored by fighter directors, using radar, one of the first uses of radar-controlled fighter interception in carrier warfare. American pilots intercepted some Japanese aircraft on the way in, shooting down several, breaking up formations. But the Japanese were experienced, aggressive, and determined. The attack on Lexington was devastating. Torpedo bombers came in from multiple angles, the classic anvil attack that Japanese pilots had perfected in training. Lexington was a large ship, fast, but not agile. She turned hard, trying to avoid the torpedoes, but the attackers were too well coordinated. 2 torpedoes struck her port side almost simultaneously. The big carrier shuddered from the impacts. Damage control parties rushed to contain the flooding, but the hits were serious. Ruptured fuel tanks, flooded compartments, a developing list. Then the dive bombers arrived. 2 bombs hit the flight deck, penetrating into the interior spaces. Fires started. Lexington was hurt. Yorktown was luckier, or better handled. She was smaller, more maneuverable, and her captain was aggressive in his evasive maneuvers. Japanese torpedo bombers attacked from multiple angles, but Yorktown's violent turns and speed changes caused most torpedoes to miss. 1 hit struck her port side, causing flooding and a slight list, but damage control contained it. A single bomb hit struck the flight deck, penetrating several decks before exploding. The damage was serious, but not crippling. Yorktown could still make speed, could still operate aircraft. By noon, the strikes had returned or been recovered. Both sides took stock. The Americans had damaged Shokaku, putting her out of action. They had lost several aircraft in the attack. Lexington and Yorktown were both damaged but operational. Fletcher withdrew south, opening the range, waiting to see if the Japanese would pursue. Takagi also withdrew. Shokaku needed to reach a repair yard. Zuikaku was undamaged, but had lost a third of her aircraft, some shot down, some ditched when they could not find their carrier in the weather, some lost to operational accidents. Japanese pilot losses were significant. Takagi decided the operation could not continue. Without 2 fully operational carriers providing air cover for the invasion convoy was too risky. The battle seemed to be over. Both carrier forces were withdrawing. The invasion had been called off. Then Lexington died. The torpedo hits that morning had ruptured fuel lines and tanks. Aviation gasoline vapor accumulated in the lower compartments. No one realized how much until 12:47 p.m. when a spark, probably from a generator motor, ignited the vapor. The explosion ripped through the ship's interior. Fires spread rapidly through the ventilation systems. Secondary explosions followed. The damage control parties fought desperately, but the fires were beyond control. Lexington's captain kept the ship moving, kept launching and recovering aircraft, trying to save her. By mid-afternoon, it was hopeless. The fires were reaching the bomb and torpedo magazines. Admiral Fitch ordered abandon ship. Destroyers moved in to take off the crew. Over 2,700 men were rescued. At 7:52 p.m., a destroyer fired torpedoes into Lexington to finish her. She sank after dark, taking 216 men with her. Both sides claimed victory. The Japanese had sunk a fleet carrier. Lexington was one of America's precious few and damaged Yorktown. The Americans had sunk Shoho, damaged Shokaku, and forced the cancellation of the Port Moresby invasion. In terms of ships sunk, the Japanese won tactically. In terms of strategic objectives, the Americans won. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. Australian security was maintained. and the southern advance of the Japanese Empire was stopped for the first time. But the real significance of Coral Sea was not who won or lost. It was what the battle revealed about carrier warfare. For the first time in history, major naval forces had engaged without ever seeing each other. The battle had been fought entirely by aircraft. Surface ships, cruisers, destroyers, even the carriers themselves existed primarily as platforms for launching and recovering aircraft. The admirals commanding these forces were managing a three-dimensional battle fought at ranges their predecessors could not have imagined. Everything about the battle was improvisational. Search procedures were ad hoc. Strike coordination was primitive. Damage control doctrine for carrier battle damage was being written in real time aboard burning ships. Fighter direction was in its infancy. Radar could detect incoming raids, but vectoring fighters to intercept was uncertain. Communication between ships was often garbled or delayed. Commanders made critical decisions with incomplete information and no playbook. Both sides learned harsh lessons. The Americans learned that carriers were vulnerable, that even successful defense could not prevent damage, that losing a fleet carrier hurt far more than sinking a Japanese light carrier. They learned that coordination between carriers was essential, that search procedures needed to be systematic, that fighter defense needed better doctrine and more fighters. Most importantly, they learned that carrier battles were attritional struggles, where pilot losses mattered as much as ship losses. The Japanese learned that American carriers were dangerous, that American pilots were competent, that the easy victories of December and January were not going to continue. They learned that damaged carriers were vulnerable to secondary disasters, that weather could hide ships or betray them, that their combat air patrols were not always sufficient. They also learned something more subtle. American damage control was excellent. Yorktown had taken a torpedo and a bomb and remained operational. Japanese carriers with similar damage often lost propulsion or could not recover aircraft. Shikaku returned to Japan for repairs that took months. Zukaku was undamaged but had lost most of her experienced aircrew. Both carriers would miss the next major operation, the Midway campaign. Their absence, the missing carriers and missing pilots, would prove decisive 4 weeks later, when the Japanese needed every carrier they had. Coral Sea was a tactical draw, a strategic American victory, and an operational disaster for Japanese planning. Lexington's loss hurt. She was a big, capable ship with an experienced crew and air group. Her sinking left the Pacific Fleet with only 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise Hornet and the damaged Yorktown. Japanese intelligence knew this. They knew the Americans were outnumbered in carriers, that another aggressive operation could destroy American carrier strength completely. This assessment, this belief that the Americans were weak and could be finished off, led directly to Midway. The men who fought at Coral Sea had improvised their way through the first carrier battle in history. Pilots had flown into combat without clear doctrine, attacking ships they had never seen before, navigating back to carriers using dead reckoning and hope. Damage control parties had fought fires and flooding in situations their training had never anticipated. Admirals had commanded battles where the enemy was beyond visual range, where reports came in fragments, where decisions had to be made immediately with incomplete information. They had shown that carrier warfare was possible, that aircraft could sink ships, that battles could be fought at ranges measured in hundreds of miles. But they had also shown how uncertain it all was. Both sides had launched full strikes at wrong targets that morning of May 7th, the Japanese at an oiler, the Americans at Shoho, when the fleet carriers were the real prizes. Both sides had struggled with coordination, communication, and timing. The battle had been won not through superior doctrine, but through luck, individual initiative, and the competence of officers who refused to be paralyzed by uncertainty. The strategic geography of the Pacific had not changed. Port Moresby remained allied. The Japanese Empire had stopped expanding southward. The Coral Sea, which had been contested water, remained contested. But the nature of naval warfare had changed forever. Battleships still existed. Cruisers still screened carriers. Destroyers still hunted submarines. But the decisive weapon was the aircraft carrier, and the decisive battles would be fought by pilots in single-seat aircraft, not by admirals watching through binoculars. 3,000 years of looking at the horizon, of seeing your enemy, of judging range by eye, had ended in 2 days of combat in May 1942. Naval warfare was now three-dimensional, fought at distances where surface ships never saw each other, decided by pilots who were miles from their commanders. The men at Coral Sea had not intended to revolutionize warfare. They were just trying to survive and accomplish their missions. But in doing so, they had shown that everything had changed, that the old rules no longer applied, that naval combat had entered a new era, where the horizon was no longer the limit of battle. The wreckage of Lexington lies in 10,000 feet of water somewhere in the Coral Sea, undiscovered until 2018. Shoho rests nearby, the first carrier sunk by carrier aircraft. The water is deep and dark, and the ships are gone, but the legacy remains. Every carrier battle that followed Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, built on what was learned in the Coral Sea. The tactics evolved, the doctrine matured, the technology improved, but the fundamental transformation, the moment when naval warfare became something new, happened there in early May, when two forces fought for 2 days without ever seeing each other, and both sides emerged, knowing that nothing would ever be the same.